Thank you all for joining us this evening. Tonight we are going to listen to Rabbi Shlachter tell us a little bit about your Monides. No, Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher and scientist. I'm really looking forward to this. I'm going to tell him a little bit about you, okay? Okay.
That was too much.
Jack Shlachter is a physicist who worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory for over 30 years, with much briefer stints at Brookhaven National Laboratory in New York, the Atomic Energy Agency, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, the latter two based in Vienna, Austria. In parallel, Jack was ordained as a rabbi in 1995. He was the rabbi and spiritual leader for the Jewish congregation in Los Alamos for many years. He was the rabbi in Center Mauritius, New York, during his years at Brookhaven, and now serves as rabbi of Ha-Makam, a congregation in Santa Fe, New Mexico, as well as the Los Alamos Jewish Center. He has also provided rabbinic support to far-flung Jewish communities, including those in Vienna, Austria, and in Beijing, China. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Shlachter.
Thank you very much, Susan. And I want to acknowledge all the help that Susan provided to me behind the scenes as we prepared for this evening. It was really great to have you as the point of contact. It was really helpful. I also want to thank the Sala people who have worked quite hard to make these presentations in here work very well, coming on odd hours to dry run things, and it's very helpful. I have been attending the talks as best I could. Unfortunately, I missed my friend Vicky Earhart's talk, but I've been attending these talks pretty faithfully and scientifically as well. And I have to say, the standards are pretty high. The talks have been outstanding. I've really enjoyed them. I've learned a lot. I thought they were excellent presentations, and I'm hoping that you will get something out of this talk as well. The topic for this evening is Maimonides. That joke is actually attributed to my mentor, the person who ordained me, which was Rabbi Gershon Winkler. He's the one who always used to make that joke about your Monides, not Maimonides. And many of you may be familiar with him. In fact, I'm suspecting there are a few of you who probably know more about Maimonides than I do, but some of you may have never even heard of him. So I'm just going to share with you to start a quote from a review on a book about Maimonides. And in this review, the rabbi who wrote the review said, "Some people are identified as geniuses because they're able to raise daring, even unpopular questions that catch the attention of the public and motivate people to think. Others are labeled great upon their discovery of answers to life's crucial problems and the communication of those answers, spurring people to act. Both types of people work to resolve life's most serious problems, yet it is rare to find a single individual with both attributes. Maimonides was such an individual." So he was able to pose deep questions, and he was able to provide answers to deep questions as well, and it's quite a tour de force. So I thought it would be worthwhile for you to hear about him, and that's what we're going to do this evening. So, who was Maimonides? He was definitely not Mediocrities, and I actually got a t-shirt from a friend of mine, and you can see it there. It says, "Meh, good enough, Mediocrities." That's not Maimonides. Maimonides was anything but mediocre. I'm going to share with you a folk tale about him, just to tell you that his legend lives on hundreds and hundreds of years after he lived. He lived in the 12th century. This legend was told to a folk tale collector in Israel about 50 years ago. Even while still a young man, Maimonides had a great desire to study medicine. And that's the faith and science piece I wanted to share with you. Maimonides was a rabbi, but he was also a brilliant physician. In his town, there lived a Gentile physician who used to take on one student each year as his assistant to work without pay and learn medicine. When the year was up, though, the physician would kill the student to keep him from mastering the art of medicine and becoming his rival. Do you know this story? Okay. Maimonides had a great passion to learn medicine, but his mother was opposed to the idea. So there's a Jewish mother, right? She knew what the physician did every year in killing his student. And Maimonides said, "Don't worry, mother, I'll be careful." That's the Jewish son, I guess. Pretending to be a deaf mute, Maimonides applied to be the physician's apprentice. The physician tested him repeatedly until he was satisfied that Maimonides could neither hear nor speak. Then he took him on as his assistant and gestured him to sit down and work. Every day Maimonides would secretly take a sheet of paper and a pen and record what he had seen until he had set down the entire art and science of medicine. Of course, he modified, corrected, and improved this lore based on his own insight and experience. Whenever the Gentile physician went to treat patients, Maimonides would secretly write down what he heard, improving it all the while, and in this fashion he became a great physician. 5 years passed. One day, the daughter of the king of Spain complained about her head. All the physicians came to treat her, including the physician with whom Maimonides was studying, diagnosing that the princess had a frog on her brain. This is a folk tale. The princess had a frog on her brain. The physician opened her skull. Then he picked up forceps to take hold of the frog. Suddenly, Maimonides struck the physician's arm aside. "May your hand be cut off," he rebuked the physician. "What do you think you're doing? Do you want to kill the king's daughter?" The physician was astonished. For 5 years he had thought Maimonides a deaf mute. Never once had he uttered a word or given a sign that he could hear. Now suddenly he could speak, and to say such things. The king entrusted his daughter to Maimonides' care. Maimonides took a nail and a peg, heated them in the fire, and poked the frog in the legs. When the frog lifted up one leg, Maimonides placed a piece of cotton under it. In short order, the frog picked up its other leg, and Maimonides took that and removed the cotton with the frog on it from the princess's head. Then he closed her skull and sutured up the incision. The king's daughter recovered. "I don't want to leave the palace with this physician," Maimonides told the king. "He kills all his apprentices after they've been with him studying and working." "Come work with me," the physician urged Maimonides. Now you see how smart he is. He said no. So the king intervened and said, "He's going to remain in my palace. He's a greater physician than you are." This infuriated the physician. "If he's a greater physician than I am," he told the king, "let us have a contest. Each will give the other poison to drink. Whoever can cure himself will be the royal physician." The Gentile physician gave Maimonides poison to drink, but Maimonides knew the antidote. He gave his Jewish compatriots their instructions. He told them to light a fire in 7 furnaces and heat them red hot, and prepare 7 bulls for slaughter. "After I drink the poison, you must take me and pass my body through the 7 red-hot furnaces. Then take me out of the furnaces, place me inside the carcasses of the slaughtered bulls, and I will recover." The Jews got ready to do what Maimonides had told them. After Maimonides drank the poison, they took him and passed his body through the hot furnaces, and then from the furnaces into the carcasses, and Maimonides recovered. Then he stood up and said to the king, "I drank the poison he gave me, and I healed myself. Now it's my turn to give him a lethal potion, as we agreed." Maimonides took 7 boxes, each larger than the other, and placed one inside another. In the smallest of all, he placed a small vial of soda water. He wrapped the vial in 7 pieces of linen. He covered his face with a mask, predating the pandemic, picked up the boxes in tongs, and told the king, "Now I want to give him a drink." When the Gentile physician saw Maimonides with his face covered, holding the boxes in tongs, he was stricken with panic. What sort of poison is he giving me, he wondered, that he's covered his face and will handle it only with tongs. He was petrified. He had no idea what remedy to apply. The physician removed the linen wrappings and started the ordeal of opening the boxes. When he reached the 5th box, he collapsed and died of apprehension and dread. Maimonides removed his veil. He opened the last box and told the king, "Now you drink it." "Do you want to kill me?" retorted the king. "This physician died just from smelling it, and now you want me to drink it?" Maimonides said, "I'll drink it first." He opened the vial and drank from it. Then he offered it to the king and said, "It's only soda water to stimulate the appetite." The physician died of fear, not from the smell or from anything else. And with that, Maimonides stayed with the king and served as his physician and minister, living in peace and tranquility. That's a folk tale. But that folk tale was recorded hundreds and hundreds of years after Maimonides lived. So I suspect that he had a reputation as not just a physician, but an outstanding physician. And as we learn more about him, you're going to find out that he was a very important physician in the world in which he lived. So let's start by saying, who was Maimonides? And it depends who's asking the question. In English, we sometimes call him Moses. That was his first name, if you will. And then Jewish tradition didn't have last names until the time of Napoleon, so he was Moses, the son of Maimon. Maimon was his father's name. In Hebrew, we just translate that as Moshe ben Maimon, ben meaning son of. So Moshe ben Maimon. We also turn that into an acronym, the Rabbi, or Rav, Moshe ben Maimon, and I've tried to capitalize the important letters there because you will often see him referred to as Rambam. But in Arabic, he's known as, and I should have Vicky maybe read that for me, but it's something like Abu Imran Musa bin Maimun. So he's known in Arabic as a very important individual, and indeed he had an Arabic name. And we're going to talk a little bit about his influence both from the Arabic traditions and to the Arabic traditions. And then where does Maimonides come from? The last part of that name is a suffix in Greek, and it means son of. So Maimonides, the son of Maimon, and he should really be called Moses Maimonides, but sometimes we use the shorthand and just call him Maimonides. So that's where his name comes from. And here is a chronology of his life so that you can kind of figure out what we're talking about here as far as where he lived and when. We believe, and I may be a little bit off on this, there's some scholarly debate by a few years here and there, but born probably in 1138 in Cordova in southern Spain. And at the time, Cordova was ruled by a Muslim empire known as the Almoravid Empire, and this was a dynasty centered in Morocco. This was part of the golden age of Jewish culture in that part of the world. And Maimonides studied and learned for the time that he was living in Cordova, mostly with his father. Now, and I had a typo in there, I apologize. It should be the Almohads, not Alohads. They conquered the Almoravid dynasty, and when Maimonides was about 10 years old, they took over Cordova. And that was not a good situation for Jews, one of many times where Jews were forced either to die, convert, or leave. And if you were here last night, you heard me say something about 1492, but this was another situation in Spain where that happened. We don't have good records for where Maimonides went from the time he was about 10 to the time he was close to 30, maybe 28 or so. Those years he was wandering around with his family, and they were living covertly as Jews. And most scholars now believe that the family actually outwardly converted to Islam as a protective measure because they couldn't find a safe haven. So they wandered around somewhere, probably in southern Spain, possibly also in North Africa. We know that he lived in Fez, Morocco for a period. This is, again in kind of his teens. And then the family was also in what is now Israel. But at the age of 28, he settled in Old Cairo, Fustat. And he remained there for the balance of his life. So for the next 38 years, he lived in Old Cairo, and he died in about 1204. He was the physician of prominence in Old Cairo, and he served as the physician to the Sultan in Cairo. So, like I said, with that folktale, he was respected as a brilliant physician. What are some of the things that he studied when he was growing up? I wrote there that he studied Jewish texts. Well, that's kind of the traditional Jewish text, the 5 books of Moses, the Jewish Bible, and then what we call the oral tradition. First, the Mishnah, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. Mishnah was compiled as oral arguments extending over about a 400-year period from 200 before the Common Era to about 200 of the Common Era. That's the Mishnah. And then commentary on the Mishnah is known as the Talmud, and that was more arguments that were eventually recorded, also oral tradition, but that was eventually recorded around 600 of the Common Era. So Maimonides certainly studied all those works. But he studied more than that. He studied science, and this is the Faith and Science series, so I want to talk a fair amount about the science that he studied. He needed astronomy. That's science number 1. Why did he need that? He needed it to know when the new moon would occur, because that's part of setting the calendar by the Jewish calendar. Every month starts on a new moon. So you need to know when the new moon is going to be so that you can set the calendar. You also have to have holidays that have seasonal connection. So those of you who are thinking quickly will realize that the Jewish calendar is complicated because a lunar month is less than 30 days. And so if you had 12 of those, you have less than a solar cycle. And what happens is what happens to the Muslim calendar, that the holidays start to come earlier and earlier in the secular year. That's why Ramadan keeps moving. The Jewish calendar does not do that. The Jewish calendar says months are lunar months and years are solar years. And so in order to do that, you have to do what's called intercalation, which is to insert leap months every so often. So it's a fairly complicated calendar. Roughly every 3rd year, there's an extra month that's stuck in, so that holidays are moving a little bit earlier every year, and then they get pushed later, and then they move a little earlier, and then they get pushed later, but everything stays balanced. And he needed to understand those cycles so that he could do calendar calculations. You might say, well, how important is that really? I know there's a faith piece to this. So if you look at Exodus chapter 12, verse 2, it's what we call the first commandment to the Jewish people, to establish a calendar. So that makes it pretty important. Mathematics was very necessary for this, as you can imagine. So he had to learn a lot of mathematics in order to do the calendar calculations. He had to learn some astronomy in order to know about the observations that were needed. So that was part of his training. He really was a polymath, and he wore many hats simultaneously because he was the leader of the Jewish community. So kind of on the faith side, he led the community, but on the science side, he was the chief physician to Saladin. He did not have an easy life, and he experienced tragedy that I don't remember exactly when that occurred, but he kind of had this arrangement with one of his brothers that or a brother, I don't know if he had more than one, but he had an arrangement that the brother was a merchant and would sail on the water to do trading, and the brother capsized and drowned. And this led Maimonides to suffer a very serious depression. If you read his writings, he talks about going into a deep depression. And he talks a little bit about how one might overcome depression because he experienced it personally. So that's a little bit about his chronology. Here's an overview of his writings. So he's known chiefly for 3 major works, and I've put them in chronological order here, and they're really kind of the 3 phases of his life. From his early years, he wrote a commentary on the entire Mishnah. So remember I said the Mishnah was this body of work, an oral tradition that was written down around the year 200, or codified around the year 200 of the Common Era, and Maimonides wrote a commentary on the Mishnah. And I put in parentheses there the language that he wrote it in. This was written in what's called Judeo-Arabic. So it's not Arabic like modern Arabic, but it's also not classical Arabic. It's sort of in between, and it's got an admixture of some Hebrew words as well. I believe it's written in Hebrew script, but the language is not Hebrew. In his middle years, he wrote a huge work, 14-volume work, that's called the Mishnah Torah. So you hear that same word, Mishnah. Mishnah means sort of repetition. So what he did was he took all the laws from the Talmud. And I will tell you, there is an edition of the Talmud that is bilingual. It's English and mostly it's Aramaic is the language of the Talmud. But I have an edition of the Talmud at home that's 72 volumes. So that's a big commentary, right? It takes up a lot of bookshelf space. Maimonides wrote what he called the Mishnah Torah himself. This is one work. It's 14 volumes. And it does something interesting. The Talmud shares arguments, and it says, this is how we're supposed to do it. No, Rabbi so-and-so says, this is how we're supposed to do it. And it gives the debate. Maimonides said, let's cut to the chase. What's the answer? So he stripped all that commentary out of the Talmud, and he just captured sort of the salient points in this voluminous work, Mishnah Torah. That's written in Hebrew, but it's kind of Maimonides Hebrew, because Hebrew, as you probably know, was not a spoken language for many, many years. It didn't become revived as a spoken language until somewhat over 120 years ago or so. Then in his late years, he wrote the work that's probably most familiar to people, at least by name, and that's called The Guide for the Perplexed. He wrote that one in Judeo-Arabic as well. He didn't stop with those works. He was writing other things at the same time. He wrote a treatise on logic when he was quite young, I think in his teens. He wrote 10 known medical works, works on treatment of asthma, treatment of hemorrhoids, treatment of various other diseases, a list of drugs, a compendium of drugs that were known in his day. So he did a huge amount of medical documentation. He also wrote several lengthy letters that have been preserved. And he wrote a book of commandments that was part of his long-term career plan, that he needed to list out what we traditionally call the 613 commandments of Judaism. He needed to list them out so that he would make sure that he captured everything in the Mishnah Torah. So he wrote this book called the Book of Commandments. So he did a lot of writing. Let me go on to share with you something about what we know of his writings. And some of this is known because there is something called the Cairo Geniza. So remember, he spent most of his life in Old Cairo. It's actually the Old Cairo Geniza in Fustat. But there is a tradition in Judaism that if you have something where the name of God is written on the document, that you don't just throw that in the trash. And so like an old prayer book or an old scroll that has the Hebrew Bible in it or something like that, you don't just throw it in the trash. You bury it. but it's inconvenient to have to go to the graveyard every time you have, a piece of paper that you want to get rid of. So people let it build up. And they find a closet somewhere, and they stick the thing in the closet, and eventually somebody's going to go bury all that stuff. Well, there was a room off of the women's balcony in the old synagogue in Fustat that was used as the Geniza, the place where these documents would be put. And probably it had a little hole, and you just stuck another piece of paper in there, or a piece of parchment. People forgot that had been done. And around the turn of the 20th century, the late 1800s, there was a scholar named Solomon Shlachter who found evidence that there were these circulating pieces of parchment that must be coming from somewhere. And sort of like the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but about 50 years earlier, he uncovered the Cairo Geniza, and there were 320,000 fragments of parchment in there. And this picture, it doesn't show up real well, and it's a staged photograph, is my understanding. That's Solomon Shlachter, who brought all that stuff back to Cambridge University, and he's sitting in this room with these thousands of fragments, right? And what do we know from that? Among other things, there is a fragment of the Mishnah Torah, that's that middle work of Maimonides, and that is in his handwriting from about 1180 or so. It's pretty astounding. Now, you might think, well, that's not anything real exciting to have, his handwriting, but people still are working on these fragments, and just a few months ago, there was a paper published by somebody who is studying the Cairo Geniza fragments and looked at a piece of parchment and said, I recognize that letter. That's Maimonides' handwriting, because we have his signature here on this piece. Now, to me, this is a real AI job, right? You digitize all 320,000 fragments. It may already be done, but I'm not aware of it. But you digitize it all, you teach it what Maimonides' handwriting looks like, and then you just ask it, well, anything else here from Maimonides? But a scholar published a paper a few months ago, it made big waves in the Jewish press, that he uncovered a trilingual vocabulary crib sheet that is clearly in Maimonides' handwriting. And the vocabulary list has words in Hebrew, Arabic, and some dialect that was spoken in Cordova that's probably a forgotten dialect. And the words are colors, flavors and aromas, actions, and foods. So if you want to know how to correlate one language with the other, you can now look at that in Maimonides' own handwriting. And that was just a recent discovery. What did he look like? That is what people will tell you he looked like. He didn't look like that. That is possibly one of the most recognizable icons in Jewish texts. That portrait became fashionable probably in the 1700s, and nobody knows what he really looked like. But you will see this on everything, and I mean everything. So let me show you. This is a gift card, or a greeting card, I guess, that my wife found, and it says, "A miracle cannot prove what is impossible, it only confirms what is impossible," attributed to Maimonides. And here's this picture of him, right, which we have no idea that he looks like that. In any case, we don't know what he looks like, but we know what he wrote. And let's start with his commentary on the Mishnah, because that was the work from his first phase. That picture there, by the way, is a statue of Maimonides that's in Cordova, Spain. You can go see that. It's very centrally located in the Jewish area, or where we believe was the Jewish area. So let me share with you some words from the commentary on the Mishnah. So here's one piece that he says. I I'm going to get a little in trouble from those of you who subscribe to astrology. Maimonides was not an astrology enthusiast. I have entered into this subject so that you may not believe the absurd ideas of astrologers who falsely assert that the constellation at the time of one's birth determines whether one is to be virtuous or vicious. We are convinced that no compulsion is exerted, that man's conduct is entirely in his own hands, that no external influence is brought to bear upon him that constrains him to be either virtuous or vicious, blah, blah, blah. Were a man compelled to act according to the dictates of predestination, then the commands and prohibitions of the law would become null and void, and the law would be completely false, since man would have no freedom of choice in what he does. I think that's fairly unambiguous about his position on freedom of choice or freedom of will, and also says a little bit about what he thinks on astrology. This is another passage from the commentary on the Mishnah. From this point of view, the study of medicine has a very great influence upon the acquisition of the virtues and of the knowledge of God, as well as upon the attainment of true spiritual happiness. Therefore, its study and acquisition are preeminently important religious activities and must not be ranked in the same class with the art of weaving. So I think what he's saying is there's a pecking order in what you study, and physics is at the top, as we all know, right, of course. He said medicine, but he meant physics, right? And other things are further down. But what he's saying is that there's actually religious value, if you want to use the word religious, or maybe even faith value, that to understand God, to understand the universe, we need to study it, and that means we need to have science. I mean, that's why I chose this as the topic for this presentation, by the way. Something else from his commentary on the Mishnah. This is a very familiar passage to anybody who goes to a Jewish worship service. There's a passage in the Mishnah that says, all Israel have a portion in the world to come, except for the following. And then it lists people who don't have a share in the world to come. That's a passage from the Mishnah. Maimonides says in his commentary on the Mishnah, I have seen fit to speak here of many fundamental principles dealing with the basic tenets of faith, which are of very great importance. And he goes on to list 13 articles of faith. The first of them is the existence of the Creator. The second is the unity of God. The third is the negation of any corporeal nature of God. The fourth is the firstness of God, and it goes on. But there are 13 of these altogether. And why is it that somebody who goes to a worship service in a synagogue might be familiar with this? Because we have a 13-stanza hymn that we close most worship services with called Yigdal. And that's a poem that was written on those 13 articles of faith. And why is it that musically this is torturous for me? Because it doesn't fit, right? You have 13 stanzas, and so you either have to repeat the last one or do something fancy to get through the hymn. Most people who aren't musical aren't bothered by that. I really don't like singing that song because of that. He could have had 14, he could have had 12, but no, he had to have 13. In any case, those were some selections from his commentary on the Mishnah. I want to turn now to his Mishnah Torah, and let's see, I don't want to get myself too far out of order here, and I should keep an eye on the clock as well. Okay, so the Mishnah Torah goes by other names. It's sometimes called Yad or Yad HaChazakah. There is something called gematria that some of you may be familiar with that turns Hebrew letters into numbers. So, Yad is 2 letters in Hebrew. It's a Yud, which is the 10th letter, and a Daled, which is the 4th letter. So adding those together, the word Yad has a gematria value of 14. So why would this work be known as Yad, or Yad HaChazakah? Because there are 14 volumes in the Mishnah Torah. But Yad means hand or arm, and Yad HaChazakah is a phrase that you will find biblically that means the strong hand or the strong arm, usually referring to God, right? But here, his work is so important that it's referred to as Yad HaChazakah because of this connection with the 14 volumes. That picture, by the way, is a bas-relief, and it's one of 23 that are in the chamber of the United States House of Representatives in the U.S. Capitol. So somebody must have thought that Maimonides was important enough to be on there as a lawgiver, because the Mishnah Torah is really this collection of laws. It was the extraction from the Talmud of just the answers, none of the arguments. So I want to share with you some passages from the Mishnah Torah as well. And then I just have to remember how I'm doing this. Okay. So one passage from the Mishnah Torah, which I didn't copy because I don't have it in an English translation in a book form, but I should just tell you that there's the holiday known as the Festival of Booths, and it comes in the fall in the Northern Hemisphere, and you're supposed to build this booth, and you're supposed to dwell in it or eat in it or do some things in it, called a sukkah. So the holiday is known as Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles, I think. So there are many laws associated with building this booth. And one of them has to do with how open the roof can be for it still to be a valid sukkah. And so he has a passage in the Mishnah Torah that tells you how to calculate the fraction of the roof that's open based on the shadow on the ground during the day, and you can calculate if you know the height and all that. So it's an interesting passage, and the other passages that I want to share with you are also of some scientific nature. This next one from the Mishnah Torah has to do with estimating and approximating, something that most physicists are used to. He says, some readers of the Mishnah Torah who have studied science will perhaps notice that some of the methods used by me for the calculation of the visibility of the new moon, remember I said that's part of what he had to study, they operate by more or less close approximation. And those people might suspect that this is due to inadvertence or ignorance on my part. Let them not give room to such a suspicion. For if we have not striven for complete exactitude in our computations, it is only because we knew by positive mathematical proofs that such a procedure need not alarm us, since it will by no means affect the correct determination of the time of the visibility of the new moon. And this is why we have not aimed at minute exactness. You could put that into a physics paper. I mean, that really is a great passage. He goes on to say, similarly, should a reader observe that one or another of the methods leads to some minor shortage in the computation applicable to that method, let him realize that we have allowed that shortage intentionally. As against this, another result obtained by another method yields a surplus that will balance the shortage so that the final result will contain the correct figure, notwithstanding that it has been obtained by approximate values. And this allows us to avoid long and complicated calculations which are of no practical value for the determination of the visibility of the new moon and may only lead to the confusion and bewilderment of the layman who is not trained in such matters. What a perfect physics statement, how to go about approximating. He has another passage where he talks, and this is a very important part of his approach. He talks about learning from anybody who has anything to offer, whether they're Jewish or not. He's very explicit about that. But the last passage from the Mishnah Torah that I want to share with you was one that I found wonderful, and this is probability and statistics at its best. But you have to understand a little bit about Jewish law here. So if a woman gives birth to a male child, and it's the first time she's ever given birth, she's obligated to redeem that child from a descendant of the priestly tribe. It's a pretty little known ritual, but it's still observed today. It's called Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn, and here's the situation. If two wives give birth to a male child and a female child, or to two male children and one female, the priest has no claim to redemption money, since I can say the prima para, that's the woman who has never given birth before. The prima para gave birth first to the female child and then to the male child. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't set this up right. It's a man with two wives, one of whom is a prima para and one of whom is a multipara. And now we've mixed up, they both deliver at the same time and everything's mixed up, and he's basically doing statistics to figure out, do you owe the priest or the descendant of the priest some redemption money or not? And so in a case where it's sort of 50-50, or you can make a plausible argument that the prima para did not give birth to a male child, the burden's on the person who's trying to collect the redemption money, and so you don't have to give that person the money because there's no way to show that they deserve that. But this goes on, and I'll just share with you the last situation. This is two wives of two men. I think this was his Jewish joke, by the way, that this is really what, two wives go into a delivery room, All right. In the case of two wives of two men, one a multipara and the other a prima para, who gave birth to two male children, the rule is that the husband of the prima para must pay the redemption money, because there's no ambiguity, right? Clearly his wife, the prima para, gave birth to a male child. But now, if these wives gave birth to two male children and one female, the husband of the prima para must pay the redemption money, because he would be exempt only when two doubts are involved. If his wife had given birth to only one male child, he's liable. If she had given birth to both a male and a female child, he's liable and exempt only if the female was born first. And inasmuch as this possibility is more remote, he must pay the redemption money. I mean, he's really just trying to figure out all the cases and work out whether the statistics are in favor of the descendant of the priest or not. Before I leave the Mishnah Torah, I wanted to tell you, I have about 7,000 hardbound books in my house, in our house, courtesy of my wife, who's willing to let 7,000 books be in the house. This is not the most expensive book I have. It's not the most ancient book I have. It is, however, the largest book I have. It's the illustrations from a codex that was written by hand, a manuscript of the Mishnah Torah. It was written in the mid-1200s, so not that long after Maimonides died. This manuscript was written. It resides in Budapest now. It's called the Kaufman Codex. And the illustrations have been reproduced, or several of the illustrations have been reproduced, including the first page of each of the 14 volumes, which had very beautiful illustrations. So it's an illuminated manuscript, and I couldn't resist getting a copy of that to add to our collection. So we're going to turn last, well, not quite last, to the Guide for the Perplexed. This book is on many shelves, my own included, and is probably unopened on most shelves, my own mostly included. I mean, it's not for the faint of heart. This is a popular title. My father had a copy of this translated into English. It was translated into English in the 1800s, and it was reproduced by Dover Publications. You can buy this for almost no money at all, but it's very hard to get through. And it's quite philosophical in nature. That's not my area of expertise. But I did want to share with you some passages from the Guide for the Perplexed. So, am I doing this right? Yes, I think that's right. Yeah. Okay. So here's something he says. I shall begin the discourse in this chapter with a parable that I shall compose for you. And he goes on with quite a famous parable. The ruler is in his palace, and all his subjects are partly within the city and partly outside the city. Of those who are within the city, some have turned their backs upon the ruler's habitation, their faces being turned another way. Others seek to reach the ruler's habitation, turn toward it, and desire to enter it and to stand before him, but up to now they have not yet seen the wall of the habitation. And this is going to go on. Some of those who seek to reach it have come up to the habitation and walk around it searching for its gate. Some have entered the gate and walk about the antechambers. Some have entered the inner court and have come to be with the king in one and the same place. But their having come into the inner chamber does not mean that they see the ruler or speak to him, for after they come into the inner part, it is indispensable that they should make another effort. Then they will be in the presence of the ruler. Okay, and then he interprets the parable, and he says, those who are outside the city, those are biologists. No. And then he's moving his way in. I'm teasing, of course. But he goes on to talk about people of lower rank, and he's really talking about doing systematic study, that you can't approach the inner chamber. You can't actually get at what God is all about or the nature of God or anything really deep. You have to learn all this other stuff first. You have to go through all the stages. And he really does talk about the physical sciences as one of those stages that is close but not quite there. But it's, you have to do a bunch of other stuff before you get there. Some other passages from the Guide for the Perplexed. Do not ask of me to show that everything that has been said in astronomical matters conforms to the ways things really are. For in the old days, mathematics were imperfect. And he talks about what's kind of at odds with much of Jewish tradition, where Jewish tradition will often say it's the decline of the generations. The further away we are from revelation at Mount Sinai, the less wisdom we have. And he puts that on its head, and he says, no, we've actually learned some things, and we know more today than they used to know. And I would say, he would argue, that today, in the 21st century, we know more than they used to know back then. And you can read in his writings, he talks about things, like epicycles and things that are not Newtonian or Copernican, systems, because he didn't know about that back then. But I think he would support the idea that we need to keep learning, and that's how we progress. Let's see, I had several other passages from the Guide for the Perplexed, but I want to just share with you maybe one or two more. Let's see, I have... And he's very Aristotelian, by the way. So a lot of what he is looking at is Aristotelian. Oh, here's one that I want to share, because this, to me, is Occam's razor. Occam's razor is really 14th century. Maimonides is 12th century. But listen to this. Know with regard to the astronomical matters mentioned, that if an exclusively mathematical-minded man reads and understands them, he will think that they form a cogent demonstration that the form and number of the spheres, this is the astronomical spheres idea, is as stated. Now, things are not like this, and this is not what is sought in the science of astronomy. Some of these matters are indeed founded on the demonstration that they are that way. Thus, it has been demonstrated that the path of the sun is inclined against the equator. About this, there is no doubt. But there has been no demonstration whether the sun has an eccentric sphere or an epicycle. Now, the master of astronomy does not mind this, for the object of that science is to suppose as a hypothesis an arrangement that renders it possible for the motion of the star to be uniform and circular, with no acceleration or deceleration or change. And at the same time, the astronomer seeks as much as possible to diminish motions and the number of the spheres. For if we assume that we suppose as a hypothesis an arrangement by means of which the observations regarding the motions of one particular star can be accounted for through the assumption of 3 spheres, and another arrangement by which the same observations are accounted for through the assumption of 4 spheres, it is preferable for us to rely on the arrangement postulating the lesser number of motions. I think that's very much Occam's razor. So, I think that's good for the Guide for the Perplexed, and I'm just going to share with you a few more passages from from some of his other writings to bring this to a close. So that's a fanciful picture, I think, of Maimonides. Again, we know nothing about what he looked like. But I wanted to share with you a little bit from his treatises and letters, because I think these are also valuable and not even on his top three. So he says, I spoke of human illnesses. This is one of his medical writings. He says, my intent is to stimulate you with some highly important advice in your consideration of and belief in authorities in various fields. It is that if any man declares to you that he has found facts that he has observed and confirmed with his own experience, even if you consider this man to be most trustworthy and highly authoritative, be cautious in accepting what he says to you. If he attempts to persuade you to accept this opinion, which is his viewpoint, or any doctrine that he believes in, then you should think critically and understand what he means when he declares that he has observed it, and your thoughts should not become confused. Rather, investigate and weigh his opinion or that hypothesis according to the requirements of pure logic, without paying attention to his contention that he affirms empirically. There's another passage that he speaks about his depression. I told you about that. It's not terribly scientific, I would say, but it's quite powerful as a personal expression of what depression is all about. And let's see, did I want to do... So he wrote a lengthy letter about astrology as well, and I'm not going to share that with you. But let me say that in closing, this is a picture of his tomb in Tiberias. I don't know that he actually was transported after he died to the land of Israel, but there is this massive structure there that you can go to now, and it's claimed to be the tomb of Maimonides. But why should you not think that you're very busy? I'm going to share with you as my closing passage. This is a letter that he wrote to one of the translators of his works, a man named Samuel ibn Tibbon, who translated the, I think it's translated the Judeo-Arabic into Hebrew. Am I right, Vicky? I think that's right. So here's what he says. With respect to your wish to come here to me, I cannot but say how greatly your visit would delight me, for I truly long to commune with you and would anticipate our meeting with even greater joy than you. Yet, I must advise you not to expose yourself to the perils of the voyage, for beyond seeing me and my doing all I could to honor you, you would not derive any advantage from your visit. Do not expect to be able to confer with me on any scientific subject for even 1 hour, either by day or by night, for the following is my daily occupation. I dwell at Fastat, and the Sultan resides in Cairo. These two places are some distance from each other. My duties to the Sultan are very heavy. I must see him every day early in the morning when he or any of his children or any of those in his harem are indisposed. I dare not leave Cairo, but must stay during the greater part of the day in the palace. It also frequently happens that 1 or 2 royal officers fall sick, and I must attend to their healing. Hence, as a rule, I leave for Cairo very early in the day, and if nothing unusual happens, I do not return to Fastat until the late afternoon. Then I am almost dying with hunger. I find the antechambers filled with people, nobles and common people, judges and bailiffs, a mixed multitude who await the time of my return, because he was dual-hatted. He was the religious leader of his community, but he was also this scientist/physician. I dismount from my animal, wash my hands, go forth to my patients, and entreat them to bear with me while I partake of some slight refreshment, the only meal I take in the 24 hours. Then I go forth to attend to my patients, because he's got medical patients there too, and write prescriptions and directions for their various ailments. Patients go in and out until nightfall, and sometimes until 2 hours or more in the night. I convene with and prescribe for them while lying down from sheer fatigue, and when night falls, I am so exhausted that I can scarcely speak. In consequence of this, no Jew can have any private interview with me except on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. On that day, the whole congregation come to me after the morning service when I instruct them as to the proceedings during the whole week. We study together a little and then they depart. Some of them return and read with me the afternoon service. In that manner, I spend the day. I have here related to you only a part of what you would see if you were to visit with me. So, however much we complain about being busy, I think he was pretty busy. He lived a very full life. I think he really was a 12th century exemplar of faith and science unified in one individual. Many of his works have been translated into English, and I hope you've learned something about this amazing individual, and there are some acknowledgments and references. Thank you.